अमरकंटक के वन आच्छादित क्षेत्रों तथा पहाड़ी अंचलों में रहते हैं। बैगा को छोटा नागपुर क्षेत्र की भूमिया जनजाति से निकली शाखा माना जाता है। एक बैगा उत्पत्ति कथा के अनुसार चारों ओर लहराते जल के बीच एक काली चट्टान थी, जिसमें से बांस का झुरमुट निकला था। बांस के एक पोले हिस्से से बैगिन और दूसरे से बैगा पैदा हुआ। बैगाओं के 5 मुख्य गोत्र हैं और वे हर गोत्र से जुड़ा एक गढ़ या पवित्र स्थल तथा गोत्र चिन्ह मानते हैं। बैगा गोत्र या वंश को जात कहते हैं। बैगा समुदाय की सामाजिक संरचना बड़ी व्यवस्थित और सुचारू रूप से काम करने वाली है। बैगा अच्छे शिकारी भी होते हैं तथा विविध जानवरों, पक्षियों को पकड़ने के लिए कई तरह के फंदे भी प्रयोग में लाते हैं। हरे भरे साल के जंगलों के बीच रहने वाले बैगाओं की वेशभूषा अत्यंत सरल और प्रायः श्वेत प्रधान होती है। बैगाओं का सौंदर्य बोध बहुत ही खास गांभीर्य लिए होता है। यहाँ तड़क भड़क की तनिक भी गुंजाइश नहीं है। बैगा स्त्रियों को गोदने का इतना शौक रहता है कि वे शरीर के प्रत्येक हिस्से पर बहुत मोटे और विस्तृत गोदने गुदवाती हैं। शरीर के हर भाग के लिए एक खास गोदना होता है तथा गोदने का काम बादी बदनिन समुदाय के लोग किया करते हैं। बैगा स्त्री और पुरुष नृत्य के बेहद शौकीन होते हैं तथा मढ़ई मेलों में रात रात भर नाचते रहते हैं। बैगानी कर्मा, सैला, बिल्मा, परघोनी, फाग, झरपट, गेंडी आदि बैगाओं के प्रमुख नृत्य हैं। आप देख रहे हैं ट्राइबल फर्स्ट, सिर्फ पब्लिक फर्स्ट पर, सर्वदा भारतीय।
ये है इंडिया फर्स्ट कम्युनिकेशन और आप देख रहे हैं पब्लिक फर्स्ट, सर्वदा भारतीय। ये है इंडिया फर्स्ट कम्युनिकेशन और आप देख रहे हैं पब्लिक फर्स्ट, सर्वदा भारतीय।
अहं राष्ट्री संगमनी वसूना चिकितुषी प्रथमा यज्ञियाना तां मा देवा व्यदध पुरुत्रा भूरिस्ता।  . . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . . 。 。 . . 。 。 。 。 。 。 。 . 。 。 。 。 。 。 。 . 。
. . . .
प्रदेश में टमाटर उगाने वाले किसानों पर जैसे गाज गिर गई है। मंडी में टमाटर के भाव 1 रुपये से नीचे मिल रहे हैं। हालत ये है कि बड़वानी और छिंदवाड़ा के किसान अपने ही हाथों से अपनी फसल को बर्बाद करने पर मजबूर हैं। देखिए किसान फर्स्ट की ये खास रिपोर्ट। मध्य प्रदेश में लाल टमाटरों ने अपने ही किसानों के हाल बेहाल कर दिए हैं। मंडियों में टमाटरों के उचित मूल्य नहीं मिलने से किसानों की नाराजगी जायज है। वहीं बड़वानी और छिंदवाड़ा के किसानों ने तो अपनी ही फसल को अपने हाथों से नष्ट करने पर मजबूर होना पड़ रहा है। मंडी में व्यापारियों ने बताया है कि पिछले साल दिसंबर माह में टमाटरों के भाव 40 से 50 रुपए प्रति किलो थे। पूरे साल टमाटर की कीमत कम नहीं हुई थी क्योंकि बेमौसम बारिश की वजह से एक सीजन का टमाटर खराब हुआ था। लेकिन इस बार भाव वैसे गिर गए हैं कि टमाटर 40 पैसे प्रति किलो तक बिका है। इस वजह से इस बार किसानों को टमाटर की फसल से बेहद नुकसान सहना पड़ा है। किसान फर्स्ट सरकार से अपील करती है कि वह जल्द से जल्द टमाटर किसानों को राहत के लिए कुछ इंतजाम जरूर करें।
ये है इंडिया फर्स्ट कम्युनिकेशन और आप देख रहे हैं पब्लिक फर्स्ट, सर्वदा भारतीय। इंडिया फर्स्ट कम्युनिकेशन और आप देख रहे हैं पब्लिक फर्स्ट, सर्वदा भारतीय।
Development goals, and the chair for this session is Ambassador Amar Sinha, Distinguished Fellow, RIS, New Delhi, India. I would request him to come on the dais. The keynote address speaker for the session is Shri Sandeep Chakravarti, Joint Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. And the panelists for the sessions are Mr. Ui Gehlen, Head German Development Cooperation in India and Minister at the Germany Embassy in New Delhi. Dr. Andre de Mello D'Souza, Coordinator International Exchange and Cooperation, Institute of Applied Economic Research, Brazil. Mr. Gerardo Bracco, Associate Researcher, German Institute for the Development and Sustainability, Germany. Dr. Ruchita Beri, Senior Research Associate, Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi. Dr. Stephen Klingbeil, Head Research Program, German Institute of Development and Sustainability, Germany. And few panelists will join online. Ms. Anthea Mulakala, Senior Director, The Asia Foundation. Dr. Zheng Chuanghong, Associate Professor, China Agricultural Research University. Ms. Anna Fernandez, OECD, Paris. I welcome you all on this session. Now I am handing over the mic to the chair of this session. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. Welcome to day 2 of our conference in Bhopal. Well, you had a very intensive day yesterday. Of course, today it's half a day, but this panel I see is very packed. We are starting with our Joint Secretary who looks after West Europe in the Ministry of External Affairs. He makes a presentation. And theme, as you know, is the role of triangular cooperation in localization of SDGs. I think it will be stating the obvious that the problems that are faced by the world, and particularly the developing world, are so complex that partnerships and triangular cooperation are something, an element of choice for all policymakers. So we would start with Shri Sandeep Chakravarti. He will do a presentation for 10 or 12 minutes. Then we have actually 8 speakers. 3 of them are online. So we will have to restrict our remarks to perhaps making the top line bullet points of your presentation, because we have exactly 50, 60 minutes and something extra to spare in case there are some questions. So Sandeep, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I will make a small presentation on, I hope this is connected. Can we get the laptop on the screen, please? Yeah. So can you see it? Yeah. So good morning. So my presentation is about triangular cooperation, and you may be wondering why I am, as Joint Secretary Europe West, making this presentation. So I will start with an explanation. I am doing this because I have been involved in promoting triangular cooperation with some of the countries that I work with, notably Germany, UK, France, and the EU. And I will later tell you where the triangular cooperation with these 4 entities stand. And there have been some very interesting developments. So my presentation today would actually give you a flavor of what is happening, because many a times we dabble with theory and concepts and principles, and rarely we get a chance to see what's happening on the ground. So I will bring you the ground story. So my question to all of you is that what do you think is the most stable structure or design in geometry? What is the most stable structure in geometry? Any guesses? It's the triangle. That's why we find triangle used in construction, in bridges, in our ancient temple design, and in the design of our modern temple, our new Parliament House. It's triangular. So there is some basis of triangular cooperation. I hope this runs. So triangular cooperation, it has a lot of history. It started with what is known as South-South cooperation, or technical cooperation amongst developing countries, TCDC. And there were many UN conferences and meetings held. The most notable one was in 1978 in Buenos Aires, where it identified 15 areas for technical cooperation, because traditionally technical cooperation has been north-south, but in the late 70s it was felt that there is a lot of scope for technical cooperation among southern countries. And as we know from India's development cooperation story, India has been in the forefront of pushing for South-South cooperation. So these are the milestones, and in 2019, there was the BAPA Plus 40 conference in Buenos Aires, where the Buenos Aires Action Plan was discussed. And it recognized the importance of triangular cooperation. And you can see these were the relevant sections from the BAPA Plus 40 declaration. and it gave the basis for greater South-South cooperation and also involvement of the North in triangular cooperation. So what is triangular cooperation? I call it the Three Musketeers, and these are the three elements of triangular cooperation. As you can see, there will be a beneficiary partner which will make the demand on the development partners. There will be a pivotal partner, and in India's case, it is us, it is India, and there will be a facilitating partner which will facilitate this interaction, and more often than not, we also find that the facilitating partner puts in the necessary financial muscle into the trilateral cooperation. So this is the basis of trilateral cooperation, and it has two kinds of objectives, as you can see. One is, of course, the strategic and political objective. Basically, the strategic and political objective is that you do trilateral cooperation with countries with which you think it is important to do so. And there has to be full synergy or agreement between the facilitating partner and the pivotal partner as regarding the choice of the countries. And I will give you an example. Recently, we were planning a project with one development partner in a particular country. And after some initial enthusiasm, we dropped that project because we felt that the security situation in the country was not appropriate for implementing a trilateral project. I will share now, so having spoken a little bit about the basis on which we are working, I will share our experiences with our development partners. We have a global innovation partnership with the UK. We have triangular development cooperation with Germany. We have connectivity partnership with the EU. And we have Indo-Pacific Parks partnership with France. I also understand we have triangular cooperation with the United States and also with Japan, but that doesn't form part of this story, but maybe we can talk about it with other people who are knowledgeable, or later on we could add to that story. But basically, India's development cooperation partnership with third countries involves these four major partners and two more I mentioned. I must also say that initially we were reticent of involving a third partner. We felt that we should indulge in or go in for South-South cooperation at our own strength. But over the last few years, there has been a change in India's mindset in how we deal with development cooperation, and now we are open in inviting our developing partners into relationships and partnerships with third countries. I will now talk about the Global Innovation Partnership. This partnership was launched when former Prime Minister Boris Johnson was here in April of 2022, and we signed an MOU with the UK. If you see this slide on the left, so far India's development partnership has dealt with 5 elements. Either we do training or capacity building, we give grants, we give LOCs, and we give trade subsidies, or we provide facilitation for trade, and we do technology transfer. We in the GIP are actually looking at innovation export, and very importantly, rather than being government-led, this will be private sector driven. So GIP is basically innovation export through private sector entities, mostly startups and technology firms. So this is the structure of the GIP fund that we are creating at the moment. As you know, the UK has changed its strategy for development partnership. It has started investing in equity in enterprises and companies which meet their strategic objectives. In this case, SDG or climate-friendly goals. And we have in the GIP 4 pillars. One is, of course, grants. The other is a fund. It's a capital investment fund. One part of the kitty will be spent on impact assessment, and the fourth will be spent on technical assistance to companies which will be spreading their wings outside of India. The objective of GIP is to find and support Indian innovations which have been tested. So these are not initial stage startups. These are startups which have made their business in India. They are successful, and then now they want to go abroad or go to Africa, let's say, and they need risk capital. So the GIP will support these enterprises. This is basically how the GIP is structured, and how will we select the innovations, and what are the innovations, and how they will help us meet the sustainable development goals. So this, in a slide, I will not get into the detail, but you get a fair idea of how the GIP will work and the sectors that we are targeting at the moment on GIP. The GIP is based on something called the NEEF fund. This is not a Government of India or Government of UK joint project. It is a Government of UK FCDO investment in a fund to which later on other subscribers joined. And these people actually multiply. It is a concept of blended finance now entering development partnership, where some money is given by the government entity, and then this is then given as equity or debt to partners, and then they multiply that. Now, if you see, the NEEF fund has actually multiplied itself more than 3 times. And these some of the companies which have been supported by the NEEF fund. As you can see, these are all in the space of climate and SDG, whether it is garbage processing or solar energy or dealing with biomass or recycling of food waste. On the strength of the NEEF 1 fund, the NEEF 2 fund was also established, and we found the JICA and European Investment Bank, they joined the NEEF 2, and again many companies were supported by the NEEF 2 fund. There are some of the examples. In fact, some of these companies, the NEEF fund actually exited these companies, and they found other buyers who took over the share, and they were able to invest that money in other companies. These are some of these Indian startups which we are targeting as part of our GIP. For instance, Blue Planet is a holding company of several climate and environment sector companies which are involved in biomass processing, cleaning of landfills, etc. And this is the area in which Blue Planet works. It's an amazing company based out of Delhi, which is there in the environment and circular economy space. Then there is this company called Chakra Innovation. This is not named after me. It is Chakra means circular. So this is again a company which makes machines which you actually put on diesel generator sets, and it reduces emission from these diesel generator sets. It's totally an Indian company, Indian innovation, which is looking to take itself abroad. Then GPS is a company which has small plants which are installed in big kitchens, and it converts the food waste into biogas, which is then used in the kitchens of, and mostly you can see that these are deployed in hotels, and they have now become very popular and now are expanding their outreach in Southeast Asia. We are looking to take them to Africa. That was UK. Now we have a trilateral cooperation with Germany, and my friend from Germany is here, so maybe he will get into the details. So this project with Germany also has moved on very, very fast. On 2nd of May, this joint declaration was signed between our External Affairs Minister and the German Development Cooperation Minister. And within the last 5-6 months, we have rolled out 5 or 6 projects. This project is in Cameroon. It is actually potato seed cultivation through rooted apical cuttings. This technology has been developed by a university in Karnataka. This challenges the traditional, it's a disrupting technology. It challenges the traditional potato seed technology. And Cameroon is a large producer of potatoes. So this project has already started in Cameroon, and we are getting good response from Cameroon. This is another project of bamboo livelihoods in Ghana. India has great strength in bamboo processing, and this project we are undertaking through INBAR, International Bamboo and Rattan Network, and they have an office in Ghana, and through them India and Germany are implementing the bamboo project in Ghana. We have a women's entrepreneurship agribusiness incubator project in Malawi, and in Peru we are actually creating a geospatial portal for Manrega, a type of portal where Peru also has a rural employment program, and they did not have this technology, so our Ministry of Rural Development is helping Peru develop the geospatial mapping portal of employment generation scheme. Now you may ask why we are working in Peru. The reason is that I was ambassador to Peru, so I thought it was logical to take this project to Peru. So that's a disclaimer. Then the last one is in Benin, and this is an agribusiness, agriculture machinery business mechanization project, and this is now approved and it will take roots very, very soon. So these are the 5 projects we are at the moment doing with Germany. With the EU, we have signed the connectivity partnership, which also talks of working in third countries, and so far we have not started with the EU because the way the EU is structured, it is not easy to move the huge ship into a particular direction. But this 27th of January, we have a first meeting on how India and EU could work together in third countries. And we have with France something known as the India-France Parks Partnership. We have developed very successful park management strategies in Assam, in the Kaziranga National Park. With France, we are now aiming to take park management to Africa and work with our development partners on how best to manage national parks. So these are the 5 or 6 examples that I had to share of how the Ministry of External Affairs, along with our development partners, are working in triangular cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Joint Secretary. Yes, you did. And since you were the keynote speaker, I didn't disturb you at all. But thank you for bringing to us 2 or 3 important points that how in triangular cooperation, India first has changed its own policy. Second, that EU has emerged as a major partner in the EU countries. And of course, you gave some very interesting concrete ideas on which we are working. I may add that besides the Global Innovative Program, which of course is a new model where some innovative financing of which is plugging into the ecosystem of entrepreneurs and startups in India. That UK is also actually supporting the Global Development Center at the RIS for the last couple of years, and where we look for, and we are very happy that at least 2 of the main themes on which RIS worked has now has been announced by Prime Minister as the initiative in the Voice of Global South, both the Science and Technology Initiative, of course they have different names, and the Global Center as a South Center for Excellence, for experience sharing, etc., which is precisely what I think with great foresight RIS had started several years ago. So we are happy that we are moving ahead on that. We now have 8 speakers, so unfortunately I'll have to apportion the time very strictly. So I'd suggest that each one sticks to 5 minutes. We'll start with Mr. Uwe Gehlen, who's head of the German Development Cooperation in India and Minister at the German Embassy in New Delhi. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Oh yeah, perfectly. And lucky-wise, I'm sitting beside you, so you can just control me when you see it takes too long. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. This is a marvelous conference on a tremendously timely and well-suited subject. And as understood out of the preparation also, it's trilateral collaboration just to bring development on the ground to the community part. So this is something which really fits into the understanding the German Development Cooperation is following. By the way, Sandeep, You were ambassador in Peru, no question about it. There's another linkage you're not aware about. I used to be sector manager for GIZ in a former life, and I had projects running in India and in Peru on social protection. And I prepared the ground, actually, to let this happen. No, the interesting thing is it's really, when you look on trilateral, it's about networks. How do you make use of existing networks, how you create, how you reform networks? And for the German Development Corporation, the understanding all over the trilateral concept is that the solutions of today are not made anymore in this north-south pattern. It took us a while to understand that a little bit, Keen. So it went to the north-south to south-south, then to trilateral, and I'm sometimes I formed once, just years ago, a global conference in Berlin as a standard pattern around the development of social protection schemes worldwide, understanding that a lot of the ideas and solutions which are created facing the challenges of today are formed all over the world. And the interesting thing is really to put people together to take the bits and bytes out of this whole meal and reform it in your specific national context. And having that in mind, to understand that we are growing more and more to a global community of knowledge and practice, this is the important starting point. So for us, the German Development Corporation suited very well in a kind of an instrumental mix-up, which gives us the opportunity for interact together with partner countries and partner governments all over the world, having these two large instruments, GIZ for the technical collaboration and KfW for the financial means. The question would be what we are doing exactly, how we are doing. And there is a standard instruments we are working on, as we have in India, for example, a large portfolio jointly with the Indian government agreed on, which is now framed under the Global Sustainable Development Partnership, facing the actual challenges on climate change and social development and all of these. We understand that there's even more in the basket which needs to be done, and where we can just build on experience which is made not only in Germany or in Europe, but it's also made in other places. So for us, it's a true value to collaborate in India and with India around this new instrument, and it's something which needs over the pathway to be enlarged. So the examples were already mentioned, and when you look on the substance of the examples related to the German intervention or the German collaboration, it's very much in the heart of the SDG core principles. And this is very important for us as well. It's when you look on trilateral collaboration, you have always, in these days, a starting point from SDG 17. It's about partnership. But for us, it can't be partnership for partnership's sake. It has to be the substance which is lying down in the SDGs where we are jointly committed on. So you have to create really the development impact, the sustainability impact. Sometimes the development starts very small. You saw this potato plant story in the whole thing, but this is really where you make the difference. And this is really where you start a broader development about quality insurance within a partner country, which is not as far developed institutional-wise as you would expect for just hooking up to the international market and all of these. So it's not really that we would like to, let's say, foster private sector per se or something like this. It's about that we make the change on the substance really where the shift has to happen. And this is, you know, in a collaboration with a country which went already through this pathway, it's tremendously helpful. Take out an example for social protection where I feel very comfortable with is, you know, Germany, whenever we are asked for experience on this one, we have one big problem with that. We invented the Bismarck reforms over 100 years ago. Believe me, this is nothing in my social economy which is from any positive view anymore, because we went through so many reforms and we are so used to the whole thing that it's really not, we are not the ones who really come up with solutions for a modern world. It's well maintained and well working in our space, but it's not something you can export. The interesting thing is to collaborate with country governments who had the experience just recently, how to transform in a modern way. And I figured out, and we will go deeper into this potentially and work on that. It's when you look on the health sector, the digitalization process happened in India is mind-breaking. It's unbelievable, and this is the new. That's what do you call it? This is the new black. This is how you have to do it. And a lot of well-suited economies who worked on that for decades are not able to hook up with this in a tremendous in the right manner. So this is really where you have to pick out of this. This is wonderful, and where we are looking. So, in a nutshell, or just to a final end, it's we have a tremendously well experience in this project. We already set up in a timely manner. It's coming from the development work. Everybody's complaining usually you take too long. But the answer is no. If everything is right, and if we would like to go and we have an agreement on that, it's not taking long. Because we use our experience and our network actually to set up this, and we are able to do. So this is a tremendously well suited experience and example for a good and a successful collaboration on a joint understanding what needs to be done. And we already discussed when always we meet, we start to discuss new initiatives. Huh? That's what happens. It took us 2 minutes for two new, actually. And I'm very much looking forward for this German-Indian collaboration plus, because with Triangular, you never have to forget the other one who comes up. And we are now just very keen in Africa. But even I can expect, if we have the right opportunities, we can look a little bit broader. And I'm very, very happy to go. And I hope I'm kept the time.
You did. Thank you very much. I turn to Dr. André Melo de Souza, who is, of course, from the Institute of Applied Economic Research from Brazil. Brazil, as you know, that we already actually a very good example of trilateral cooperation between India, Brazil, and South Africa, and within the IPSA format. Dr. de Souza, the floor is yours, and you have 5 minutes starting now.
Many thanks, Ambassador. And many thanks to IRS, and particularly Professor Sachin Chaturvedi for the invitation to take part in this special event of the T20. Development ultimately and concretely takes place at the local level. And that is the main reason why localization processes are so important. And accordingly, development cooperation projects, they must involve stakeholders, be they state governors, mayors of municipalities, NGOs, local businesses, or other private non-state actors. Now, localization may proceed via two main mechanisms in international cooperation that is aimed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. First, local stakeholders may need to be presented to the SDGs. It may be the case that they're not familiar with the SDGs, and when they become familiar with the goals, they can better adapt to them, and they can plan their actions in accordance with them. And secondly, they can also contribute to the fulfillment of the SDGs nationally by means of the actions that they undertake. So I would argue that localization is particularly crucial for the pursuit of the SDGs, because the SDGs can be seen as a model or an approach that in many ways is one size fits all, right? The targets and the indicators were defined for the entire international community, but oftentimes local conditions require that they be adapted, because as originally defined, they may become irrelevant, or they might even not be appropriate for fulfilling the goal of development. And so local, cultural, political, and economic contexts are key. And local stakeholders are, for obvious reasons, the ones that are most knowledgeable of these contexts, and the ones that are better suited to adapt the SDGs to these contexts. But there are dangers to localization as well. Local stakeholders, they may lack the bigger picture, and they need some sort of central coordination so that they don't act independent of each other and in ways that don't provide synergies or that don't promote development most effectively. And hence, while localization it may be more important to continental countries such as my own, Brazil, or such as India, China, Mexico, Argentina, and others, than to smaller countries. It is also clear that in these bigger countries, coordination becomes more challenging. The reason is clear. Countries with larger territories, they have more subnational units to develop and to coordinate, and these units tend to be more diverse as well. But institutions also matter, and political institutions shape the way that central governments relate to subnational units. Most notably, in non-democratic countries or countries with very weak institutions, localization may threaten or may weaken national governments, and that may be a problem that needs to be kept in mind. And in this regard, we have some examples of development interventions that are channeled by national governments to local governments. And that might be the best alternative. And I'll give you two examples from my own country. The Amazon Fund, which is provided by both Norway and Germany to preserve rainforests in Brazil, it is channeled by the central government. And from there to the states and the municipalities that compose the Amazon in Brazilian territory. Another one is the widely known conditional cash transfer program, Bolsa Familia, which Brazil actually helps to replicate elsewhere in the world. But it is also centrally administered by the government and dispensed by mayors in municipalities. The municipalities are the ones that register the families that are in need of these transfers and that receive governmental support. And this leads me to the role of triangular cooperation localization. The complementarities and the synergies that are the main comparative advantage, if you will, of triangular cooperation, they also apply to localization. And so southern providers, they tend to be more knowledgeable of the local context and to understand better how similar countries operate. While the northern providers or the international organizations, they may help with monitoring and the oversight of activities, thereby ensuring their effectiveness. But on the downside, accountability becomes more complicated at the local level when you have triangular cooperation schemes, because it's not always clear who is responsible for what and who local stakeholders ultimately should respond to. Would they be the southern provider, the northern provider, or the international organization? Or rather, should they be mostly responsive to the national government? That is not always clear. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You stuck to your time perfectly. May I turn to Mr. Gerardo Bracho, Associate Professor at the German Institute for Development and Sustainability. Dr. Bracho?
Yes.
5 minutes. And at 5 minutes, I'll give a small tap on the mic.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm actually Mexican. I'm associated researcher at the German Institute, but I'm representing more my Mexican view, let's say. I'm quite happy to be the third in line because we already heard a bit about triangular cooperation, the good things about triangular cooperation, and then Andre made a very good defense on the question of localization. And I will also go a bit more on the issue of localization and try to bring a bit later on both themes that we have today, triangular cooperation and localization. Both of them are very trendy. They are very fashionable nowadays. Triangular cooperation has been supported and promoted by the North, for example, in the OECD, but also by the South, for example, in the VAPA plus 40 meeting. And equally, localization is very fashionable today. It's like a new paradigm where, of course, as Andre was telling us, it's about going local. And again, this is strongly promoted, as I see, especially by USAID, but also by other development agencies. Actually, I was in the Geneva GPDC conference a few weeks ago, and there was a statement on local led development that was taken up by 13 donors. I think the Germans were not there, but anyhow. And but there was the US, Japan, France, UK, the typical suspects. And also the southern providers, as I understand, also are taking up this idea. I recall very much in Delhi 6, we had the Sherpa from India, Mr. Kant, who was actually saying that very important in the Indian view of their own cooperation was very much about empowering citizens. And of course, if you empower citizens, that means that you work at the local level. But I want to get a bit on the issue of this concept of localization. You know, I can see this concept of localization as a third step in the evolution of the principle of ownership. Those that are more or less familiar with the development effectiveness agenda will recall that originally in the Paris Declaration, and I'm talking about 2005, and which is the founding document of this agenda of effectiveness, aid effectiveness, ownership was understood as and it was together. I mean, they had two concepts in Paris: ownership and alignment. And ownership was understood as aligning to the central government or to the federal government priorities. So if you respected the ownership of a certain country, you should align with the priorities of the federal government of that country. That's 2005 in Paris. We moved 6 years later. We are now in Busan, 2011. We have all these new actors coming into the development cooperation architecture, CSOs, parliaments, local communities, cities, etc., etc. And then the idea of ownership as only belonging to the central or the federal government was put in question. And they came up with this idea that when we talked of ownership, we should talk about whole society ownership. So that's Busan in comparison with Paris 6 years later. Now we move another 10 years. We're in Geneva, another summit of the GPDC on effective development, and the concept of localization comes out. And I think actually localization is a way of putting in practice the idea of ownership as a holistic concept that requires the whole society. And all sounded very good, no? All sounds very good, and to a large extent it is. And Andre was making a good argument for this. But we were in Geneva. I was in this session where the donors took this statement on localization. They made a good defense on the concept, etc., etc. Then I moved to another session on fragile states, and what do I find? I find a nation, a high official from a low-income country from Asia, and a very high official, a minister actually, from a low-income country of Africa, making a very strong critique of this concept and of this practice. What were their points? They were saying that they were ignored. I mean, central governments were ignored with this type of practice. They were bypassing their governments. That was weakening their state. Their institutional capacity was being weakened, and the legitimacy of their own governments had been also put on stake by this type of practices. And they were saying, we are not against local development, but we are against donors bypassing us, not coordinating with us, and not aligning with our priorities. What were these two gentlemen doing? Actually, they were defending the original concept of ownership from Paris in relation to the new concept of ownership in Busan. And well, a very interesting thing happened, because sometimes in this type of conferences, there's no discussion, things like that. But happily enough, I must say that Suzanne Moorhead, the chair of the DAC, was there, and she made a good defense of the donors' cause. And she said, well, I mean, we are not going to give aid to central governments that are violating human rights very openly. And she made the case of a country that doesn't even allow girls to go to school. So, of course, I mean, she had a point. But then also the developing countries' ministers had a point. How do we move from here? When it is justified for a cooperation provider to bypass a central government and go locally directly, and who and what ground is it? Who is going to decide this legitimately? I mean, it's not clear. I thought the discussion was there. It was very interesting. I thought the points of both parts. I couldn't really make my mind myself. And let me finish my intervention with two thoughts of this not resolved problem. And my first reflection would be on the link of triangular cooperation and localization. And I agree a bit on what André was saying. And I think that the good thing about the triangular cooperation and localization is that in a typical triangular cooperation scheme, you have a southern provider there and a traditional donor. And the southern provider is a country that normally has a profile much more near profile to the recipient country. So these triangular cooperation schemes can actually, let's say, damp the danger of giving cooperation in, let's say, illegitimate way and bypassing central governments when you shouldn't bypass central government. So triangular cooperation can actually help us to strike a good balance between these issues. And my second thought is about the G20. And then I come back to what Mr. Sachs was saying yesterday, and also Professor Gushan Sachieva from Nehru University, where they were actually arguing that the African Union should be a permanent member of the G20. And they were arguing also that India and the following presidents should take development at the center of their agenda. And of course, then my point is that, for example, the G20 would be a very good place to discuss this type of issues, which are very polemical, on the concept of ownership and the problems that localization can bring in certain contexts if we don't use it well. And I think the G20 could do this job, but only if it brings in the recipient countries as the African Union as a real partner. Because what I thought in the GPDC was that there was a discussion between recipients and donors, and if you don't have them at the same table, you cannot really resolve this type of issues. So,
thank you. Thank you. I know that I've given you an impossible timeline, 5 minutes, but you did well. I turn to Dr. Ruchira Berry. She's an senior research associate at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. Dr. Berry, I'll request you that we need, well, you have 5 minutes. I'll give you a warning tap.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. Good morning and welcome to all of you. I'm so glad to be here at Bhopal, within the center of India, Madhya Pradesh. So thanks a lot to the organizers, my friend Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, the government of Madhya Pradesh, who've really given us a very warm welcome out here. So we are meeting today in the backdrop of the twin shocks of the global pandemic, the COVID pandemic, the conflict in Ukraine, and also with a growing realization that triangular cooperation is a feature through which we can transform the global development landscape. And also, it's increasingly being recognized that triangular cooperation contributes to achieving the 2030 agenda and the sustainable development goals. So in my presentation today, I'll be focusing only on two things. First, I will give you maybe 5 examples of India's involvement in the process of triangular, South-South and triangular cooperation in particular, and leave you with 4 suggestions for the G20 process. So now India has been in the forefront of, in terms of promoting South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation. And I argue here that India's policy towards triangular cooperation is driven by the principles which support South-South cooperation in general, which is that the development cooperation is demand-driven, it rejects all conditionality, it rejects the binary of donor recipient model. It is a partnership which is mutually beneficial. So that is what I'm arguing with respect to triangular cooperation too. And India is not new. You've heard about from the previous speakers about what India is doing in the recent years and how some of our partners like Germany have come up with several examples of cooperation. But this is not a new process, and we started this in the 50s. And one of the first example was the setting up of the Colombo Plan for Cooperation and Economic Development Plan in South and Southeast Asia, which is known as Colombo Plan in the 1950s. The second was similarly setting up with our Commonwealth partners, the Special Commonwealth Assistance Plan to Africa Plan, which is SCAP. This plan laid down the foundation of India's development cooperation with Africa. Subsequently, I think I would like to give the example of the IPSA Trust Fund, which was founded in 2004. It also follows the demand-driven principles that I was talking of, partnerships, and includes promotion of food security, addressing HIV/AIDS, looking at providing safe drinking water, and contributing to the larger aim of SDGs in wherever these projects have been set up, mainly in Africa and some of the Asian countries. The fourth example that I'm giving today is the UN Development Partnership Fund, which was established in 2017, and which supports Southern-led and Southern-owned demand-driven transformation for sustainable development. And these projects have been in 15 countries till now, and they include countries from the Caribbean like Trinidad Tobago, and from others like Mali in Africa. And they've covered a broad spectrum of sectors ranging from health, education, and infrastructure and other issues. But apart from these examples, there's also the last example, which is the increasing triangular cooperations with some of the traditional donor countries with whom, as was previously mentioned, India had slight hesitation in entering into any kind of triangular cooperation. But because of the move towards pragmatic foreign policy, India is moving ahead in its partnership with some of these countries like the US and Japan, in various countries in Africa and elsewhere. Lastly, fifthly, I would say that while India has not purposely done so, but most of India's triangular cooperation initiatives have been historic, and South-South cooperation initiatives have been historically aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. For example, in Africa and in some of the neighboring countries like Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and Bhutan, India has actively facilitated capacity building and training programs, which is the SDG 17. And it has also been involved in line of credit projects in other partner countries, which include in areas such as education, which is SDG 4, health, SDG 3, and infrastructure support, SDG 9. So what I'm trying to say here is that India's development cooperation, South-South cooperation, triangular cooperation model has been historically aligned to achieving sustainable development goals. Finally, I would leave you with 4 important recommendations for the G20 process. First, I call for an active engagement of G20 under the India presidency to promote South-South and triangular cooperation as a source of innovation to support developing countries meet their immediate and long-term challenges. Secondly, the G20 should mainstream the implementation of 2030 agenda in an integrated and balanced manner. Third, I propose that G20 should help leverage domestic resources and build on local capacities. Now, capacity building has been the cornerstone of India's model of South-South cooperation. And just one more minute, sir. And India has, under its G20 presidency, should energize this. If you recall, Prime Minister Modi had announced during his visit to Uganda in 2018 the vision to build as much local capacities as possible. So I think in this context, in terms of India's partnership with the African countries, this is something which the G20 can take forward. Finally, I am basically an Africanist. I'm really passionate about Africa. So I've got this chance to basically propose that given that Africa has been the focus of India's development cooperation model for a very long time, it will be timely and appropriate for India during its presidency of the G20 to push for a greater African voices and representation in the G20. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we have the last speaker from the floor before we turn to the online participants, Dr. Stephen Klingbeil. He heads the research program at the German Institute for Development and Sustainability. Dr. Klingbeil.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as a panelist, I need to thank the organizers for inviting me here, but this is a very warm thank you to Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, IIS, and an excellent team for this opportunity to discuss those important topics here. And let me also thank again for bringing us to the local level, I know, local level Bhopal, but to to bring us here to the local level. I was so impressed by the Tribal Museum yesterday evening, and I really thought this is important to have this kind of direct experience. Yeah, what does it mean? Localization, local cultural background, etc., etc. So, but let me just turn to my 4 quick points, and I thought already we have some kind of convergence between the panelists. But the way how I want to frame it, maybe it's a bit different. 4 quick points. So, first of all, we do not have an established or functioning international regime for development cooperation. We have a club, Development Cooperation, Development Assistance Committee of the OECD. We have some other fora, but we do not have an international development regime. And my thinking is that the development working group, the development track of the G20 could become much more important. I know a number of discussions were taking place over the last couple of years, but let's say those tangible results are little. What I appreciate and what I see is that India is working a lot on the development paradigm. Yeah, how do we need to renew the development paradigm? And I think this is really great, and I see a number of innovations, but maybe India could also do a bit more on development cooperation and how to renew the development cooperation approach. So norms, practices, etc. Jointly with some in this room, Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, Elizabeth, Andrea, and some others, we published this nice paragraph handbook on development cooperation, and we understand development and development cooperation are contested concepts. But because of this, I think we need to have those common platforms to have discussions. And this is also relevant for our topic here, triangular cooperation and localization. Second point, just quickly, because it was already very well presented, triangular cooperation has a potential in this regard. It's a form of, I would say, advanced cooperation, or just using another term of our handbook, of advanced collaboration, which is a higher level of cooperation. It's able, the concept to enlarge trust, also linking to the value session yesterday. Yeah, I think this trust aspect is really important. I would even say it might have the potential to go beyond trilateral cooperation, because it's also very much about a multi-stakeholder approach. And what I also think is what is important, it's that when it comes to South-South cooperation providers, it's about, of course, emerging economies, dynamic countries like India and others, but also increasingly about even low-income countries like Rwanda. And those who know me, Rwanda is always one of my case studies, and Rwanda has its own development cooperation agency, and it's also interesting to see that also those countries are investing more and more in this. My third point, localization of SDGs is crucial, no question about it. Change has to take place on the local level. This is important. Localization of development cooperation is on vogue. You mentioned already USAID. Samantha Power, as the CEO of USAID, is pushing this very much. I like this kind of idea of localization of development cooperation, and I would say what NGOs are typically doing is localization of aid. Also good to see that some official donors are taking it up. I'm not always 100% sure whether the only intention is to make it local, but sometimes it's also about domestic politics in donor countries, like if you need to convince your own parliament how you implement your activities, it might be easier to say we are bypassing partner country structures because of a little level of trust. This brings me to my fourth point, combining triangular cooperation and localization debate. I think there's some potential in this regard, and it was already mentioned, and no doubt that many good things, but there are also relevant limitations. And let me just highlight some of them. First of all, triangular cooperation, at least this kind of main debate, also how we presented it today here, is about official actors. Nothing wrong about it, nothing wrong about official actors, but official actors do not have a comparative advantage to deal directly with the local level. This is why we have NGOs. This is point number one. Second point, what kind of activities? I mean, thinking about the local level, it's typically rather about small activities. Nothing wrong about small activities. We need those small activities. But when it comes to those official development partners, I think the main point here is to bring this kind of scaling up to partner countries. So in this regard, I'm also a bit skeptical whether the activities are really fit for this. My third point, and it was already mentioned, but this kind of bypassing of partner country structures. I think this is a real risk. We know it from the aid and development effectiveness debate that as donors, traditional donors, there is a risk that we want to ring fence our projects, that we want to make perfect projects, and we bypass partner country systems. And one main conclusion of the aid and development effectiveness debate was, no, we want to use partner country systems. And this is, I mean, I saw it, I was based for a couple of years in Rwanda. Sometimes you have this kind of situation that NGOs are coming, constructing schools, and they bring their own norms about the size of the classroom, something like this. But of course, you have a country with the capacity to say, no, the norm of a classroom is this, 30 square meters, not 25 or 50. And bypassing those partner countries' systems is risky. One last aspect, of course, we have those countries with little or no capacity to use those development resources, or where development cooperation providers have little trust in. And we should be clear about it, mistrust because of corruption, mistrust because of the political system. And in those countries, I think sometimes there is even the need to bypass partner country systems, but we should be explicit about it. We should be explicit and not pretend something else. So my quick conclusion, local level is key for SDG implementation, can be very important for development cooperation. I see a number of comparative advantages to leave this flexibility to NGOs, civil society organizations. There might be also a niche for triangular cooperation in this regard, but probably the main comparative advantage of this localization debate is a bit beyond triangular cooperation. With this, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I think your precision of timing was as good as the Deutsche Bahn. Absolutely dot on time. Thank you very much. We turn to the three participants online, and I'll mention them right away, introduce them. Anthea Mulakala, Senior Director of Asia Foundation, is joining us from Malaysia. Dr. Zhang Chonghong, Associate Professor from China Agricultural University, will be joining us online. In addition, we'll have Ms. Ana Fernandez, OECD Paris, joining us online. So let's start with Ms. Anthea Mulakala. Can you hear us?
I can, thank you.
Well,
thank you.
We can hear and see you very well, so the floor is yours, and you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Great, I don't think I'll need the 5 minutes. Thank you to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm privileged to be able to join you virtually. My organization, the Asia Foundation, also works on triangular cooperation with India, in fact, in Asia and the Pacific, supported by the United States, but also Australian triangular cooperation. So I want to make 3 points that pick up really well, I think, on the points that Stefan has just made. And that is first that geopolitics has made development cooperation a contested space. And as a result, triangular cooperation, especially when big power is involved, becomes more about, or can become more about, big power objectives than the third country development outcomes. And in this dynamic, third country agency becomes challenging. And often the partner country is the last to be consulted or brought into the triangle. And this really goes against the principle of localization. Second, in this context, triangular cooperation can often involve relatively small sums in the scope of what a pivot country, a country like India, for example, may have to offer. We know that India has significant resources to share and offer to partner countries through its South-South cooperation outside of what it does with triangular cooperation. So triangular cooperation may not be the first priority in terms of a country's broad range of development or South-South cooperation. And then a common feature of triangular cooperation is that transaction costs and time required to execute and develop these projects can be sizable. So while reasonable outcomes may be eventually delivered, and we've heard about some of those from the Joint Secretary's presentation, they are delivered for the partner country, you have to question, was it worth the time and the effort to get there? And my last point is that despite or however amidst these dynamics, the ability of non-state actors to engage is critical. They can forge triangular partnerships with relative ease and efficiency and lower transaction costs and gain programmatic precision. We heard about some notable innovations from Joint Secretary Chakravarty's presentation. And working with these kinds of actors, the private sector, working with civil society and NGOs, is important if we prioritize localization. So how then can we expand the scope for more non-state actor-led and implemented triangular cooperation that welcomes facilitation resources from government? Thank you.
Thank you. I would have been happy to give you 2 extra minutes. Actually, you performed at the time. Dr. Zhang. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you for your kind invitation. It is my great honor to join this distinguished panel. It's a pity that I can't attend in person. Actually, China's position shares quite a lot of similarities with the partners. But today, I would like to focus on the specific topic of gender equality. I would like to say that engaging China through triangular cooperation for gender equality at the local level. As we all know, the world is still far away from achieving the gender equality target set by the 2030 agenda. The achievement of SDG 5, gender disparities remain one of the most persistent forms of inequality across time and space, especially in the global south. According to the Global Gender Equality Report 2022, without appropriate intervention, another 132 years would be needed to eliminate the gap completely. The multiple crises, as we mentioned many times, we are facing today have even deteriorated the situation. At the same time, we see aid provision for gender equality between the traditional donors and the emerging economies are divergent in policy, volume, and tools. Funding for gender equality reached an all-time high from OECD countries, while gender issues were largely underfunded and even ignored by emerging donors. This is an area that desperately in need of concerted efforts of global development community. In the last 2 years, without traveling abroad, I taken this opportunity to do some research to explore how development projects from different donors impact gender equality differently at the local level. I compared the aid projects from the World Bank and China in 34 African countries by matching the geo-coded data of aid data and Afrobarometer surveys The results show that the World Bank projects can increase local women's awareness for gender equality, while Chinese aid projects show no similar effect. The effect of the bank projects differs across sectors and gender. Aid going to gender-sensitive sectors such as government and civil society and education has the most significant impact on women's attitudes toward gender equality, while men's attitudes didn't change much. We contribute this difference to the norm diffusion mechanism used by the bank, while China, defining itself as a South-South cooperation provider, usually focusing more on practical areas and emphasizing tangible results, pays little attention to gender norm diffusion through development intervention. That is to say, when aid projects are integrated with social norms, they can spread such norms in the recipient countries, although the effects is only limited to those who are willing to accept them. I think the results from this research has at least 3 implications for achieving gender equality through triangular cooperation. Firstly, emerging donors can learn from traditional donors, including multilateral organizations, to integrate gender norms in their aid projects and policies, as it is an effective approach to improving women's attitude toward gender equality. Secondly, more aid resources should be directed to gender-sensitive sectors such as government and civil society, health and education, to be more impactful and effective. Last but not the least, the policymakers and development practitioners from all development partners need to be aware that improving local women's gender equality awareness is not enough to achieve substantive gender equality in beneficiary countries. Norm change is an important step to gender equality, but without a change of legal framework and economic empowerment, improvement of women's gender awareness without men's support may lead to the prevalence of gender-based domestic violence. If we think from Chinese perspective, promoting gender equality was newly incorporated into China for the first time in China's latest foreign aid white paper, followed by President Xi's speech on enhancing global cooperation in advancing women's development at the high-level meeting on the 25th anniversary of the 4th World Conference on Women. Promoting gender equality has become the new area for China's development cooperation. However, we see gender equality to large extent means promoting women's economic empowerment, which is deeply rooted in the Marxist materialist view on women's liberation in the Chinese political context. Therefore, we think mutual learning between China and the international partners through triangular cooperation or multilateral cooperation can help to meet women's both strategic and practical needs that are necessary for achieving substantive gender equality. And most recently, quite a few new platforms and new financing resources were provided by China to support trilateral and multilateral cooperation. I just name a few, like Global Development and South-South Cooperation Fund, Group of Friends under the framework of the GDI, newly launched Global Development Professional Promotion Center Network. The central task of these platforms is to accelerate all 17 SDGs through open partnership with all development partners, including the national or subnational government, NGOs, multilateral agencies, as well as private sectors. Yet the funding for GDSSCF has been increased from original $2 billion to $4 billion. More than 60 countries have participated and benefited from this fund. However, we can see very few projects are associated with gender equality and women empowerment. Here, using this platform, I call for more international partners to pay attention to the SDG 5 on gender equality and to engage with China in this important area. I also look forward to working with you all for promoting gender equality globally and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for bringing up a very important issue of gender balance and gender equality. Do we turn to the last speaker, Ms. Ana Fernandez? We started 10 minutes late, so I think we have taken the 10 minutes extra here. So we are cutting into the tea break. Ms. Fernandez, you have 5 minutes, and I think I'll just list out the 12 key takeaways that I got from this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Sorry for not being on the room, on site. Very sorry for that. And thank you so much also to Professor Sachin for the invitation and for being such a partner in these discussions. After hearing all of you, I change a little bit my intervention. So I want to flag 3 main messages from my side. First, why is the OECD so much keen to collect evidence and analysis and to promote triangle or trilateral cooperation? Because triangle and trilateral cooperation, the evidence shows, it's delivering. And it's delivering impact results. And it's also delivering in terms of scaling up knowledge and allowing a platform for sharing knowledge and also to have much more resources allocated to that sharing knowledge. So we should not see triangle or trilateral cooperation just on the project side. It's also an investment in the partnership. And I think all the presentations that we hear also highlighted that, either the examples on concrete projects or also the discussions about how can we do it. It has these 2 dual perspectives. One, the partnership itself, and now how important it is to invest on that. In times of challenges like the ones we are facing globally, it's fundamental to create channels of dialogue. It's fundamental to bring ways of how can we do things together? How can we move things together? And that's the space that triangle and trilateral is trying to create. Also, it's not either or. And I think sometimes we tend to talk about things by saying, this is different from that, this is better than that. I think in moments of crisis, we also need to say, we can do different things. It's possible to also engage in South-South, on bilateral, on multilateral, and also on triangle. And I think that could be a very important message from the G20 also, which is, it's about the values, it's about the principles, but it's about the how. How can we do it? And how can we do it better? By complementing each other and bringing to these partnerships the different value addeds of the actors. And here I move to the point on localization. So Triangle is already engaging with a lot of known state actors. And this is important. And why is this important? Because we all know that alone we cannot do it. We cannot do it alone as a country. We cannot do it alone as a government. We cannot do it alone as a civil society. So localization, independent of all the arguments that we heard from the panel about what could be more positive, what could be tricky, what could be challenging, which is all true. It's also about bringing again to the agenda of the political discussions on the future of development cooperation and the future of development, the value of all the stakeholders, and including civil society, including foundations, included private sector, and bring that value. So we are also recognizing that they are a fundamental part and they have a role to play in the solutions we can find together. We did a very interesting paper with Professor Sachin on triangle cooperation and civil society in India. And that shows the value added of the different stakeholders and the sum of the parts when we try to bring that together. So I would say that localization is also an agenda that can bring the how again to the discussion. How can we succeed? Final point from my side, it's also related with the question about scaling up innovation and engaging in this modality of triangle cooperation and also bringing other stakeholders to this circle innovation. It's fundamental that different parts of the world start talking to each other. And I think also this opportunity to build on triangle, as it was shown by the different examples and projects, where we bring the knowledge from Asia to South America, or from Latin America to Africa, and from Africa to the rest of the world. So it's a new ownership principle that also builds on bringing those that are not necessarily on the drive seat of multilateralism to the drive seat of multilateralism, because they are showing the value, they are showing the knowledge they have. And we don't have time, to be honest, to deliver on so many challenges that we have in the world if we don't work together. So that's why we in the OECD are also organizing for the 15th of February this Global Providers Meeting, which I think it's a very important meeting to share also that knowledge about what are we doing both on climate, but also in terms of putting the SDGs back on track. We have invited India also to attend. We would be very pleased to have India attending that meeting and sharing also the knowledge there. And I would say the OECD is always happy to contribute with evidence, data, and knowledge, and collecting knowledge globally to bring those discussions to the table. But I will focus my intervention and my last message on this. It's important to discuss the why, it's important to discuss the what, but I think we need to focus also on the how and how we can scale up the how. And I think both this idea of triangle, which complements South-South, it's not against South-South or other modalities, it's also to invest on the how. And the how, it's on not only projects, it's trust and it's building partnerships. And localization, for me, has a lot of problems in terms of challenges, how to do it again, but also brings that message that governments alone cannot deliver. We need civil society to be on board, and we need these partnerships between governments and civil society. So, Mr. Chair, I stop here. I'm conscious of the time. I don't want to go beyond my time. I try to be even less than 5 minutes. I hope I succeed. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Thank you, and thank you all the participants for not only sticking to the time, but also making some valuable suggestions. If I may just take 1 minute in terms of the key takeaways that I get from this session. First, of course, everybody underlined the necessity of triangular cooperation and South-South cooperation. So there was a great deal of convergence. One thing which also came out was that there is a need for alternate and innovative financing, which goes beyond government's involvement of NGOs and civil society. A point was also made about effective mechanisms of perhaps monitoring and clear-cut sharing responsibilities. And obviously in this, for effective implementation, ownership of various stakeholders is very important. It has to be people-centric, community-oriented, etc. Of course, our Joint Secretary gave us very concrete examples from where we have moved from concept to actual concrete steps taken in implementation. One suggestion which came across very clearly was that the development working group of G20 needs to be sort of brought center stage in the international discourse. G20 arose out of a necessity of a crisis, but unless we tackle the complex challenges facing the developing world, we may have crises of different things. So we need to look at not only crisis management, but also mitigation. And one other very important point made was the necessity of bypassing local governments in some cases. Of course, this is a debatable concept, but one example which comes to me very clearly is the Afghanistan, where each one is facing the same dilemma of the necessity of partnership, of bringing humanitarian assistance, but also the need to bypass because of the nature of the government. Of course, there are different causes of corruption, one can go into that. But special situations require that. And of course, the Chinese participant made a very important point about gender equity, gender balance, gender empowerment. So with these words, I thank you all. We have taken 10 minutes extra, but we had started 10 minutes late. So thank you all for your participation, and we move for the tea break now.
Thank you, Chair, keynote speaker, and all the distinguished panelists for a wonderful discussion on the round role of triangular cooperation in the localization of SDGs. So,
ये है इंडिया फर्स्ट कम्युनिकेशन और आप देख रहे हैं पब्लिक फर्स्ट, सर्वदा भारतीय। इंडिया फर्स्ट कम्युनिकेशन और आप देख रहे हैं पब्लिक फर्स्ट, सर्वदा भारतीय।
Namaste everyone. I hope we had a good chai break, and I request everyone to take their seats so that we can begin the next session, which is on global governance and the global south, which is very important. I know we have eaten into some time in the session, so I would want to get started quickly. We have our esteemed panelists from different parts of the world, and I think it has a very good fair representation of the global south itself. As the anchor previously was mentioning, we have Dr. Fahmida Khatoon, who is the Executive Director, Center for Policy Dialogue from Bangladesh. We have Dr. Gladys Lichini, who is the Senior Investigator, National Council for Scientific and Technical Research from Argentina. Her research areas include international relations, Africa, foreign policy, and many other things. We have Dr. Vishnu Utomo, who is from Indonesia. He is the Director, Foreign Policy and International Development Cooperation from the Ministry of National Development and Planning at Indonesia. And we have Ms. Pamela Gopal, who is the Lead Coordinator, Policy Bridge Tank Program from the African Union Development Agency from South Africa. So that's a fair, good representation of the Global South, and we would be discussing more on Global South and global governance. But before we get started, I would want to share some opening remarks and take us back to the context of the seminar itself that we are having. And particularly the theme for G20, I would want to remind all of us that India, that is hosting the presidency, has chosen. And I think it is a very brave and an important theme that we have chosen. That is one earth, one family, one future. I think from Prime Minister Modi, when this theme first came out, I was very pleasantly surprised and also very happy that the theme was chosen, because actually this idea of one earth, one family, one future is a long, ancient Indian civilizational idea. It has been our message to the world, but then in the current real politic of global diplomacy and how the negotiations happen, such a very broad theme which has a very lofty idea sometimes might seem impractical. But I think through conferences like this, where we can align our thoughts, we can bring this idea into more of its practical realm. Naturally, when a theme like this is chosen, there are global governance challenges. We all know the challenges that are there. So how do we realize a lofty vision like one world, one family, one future among all the different challenges that we have on the negotiation tables that we do during summits like this? So that we'll explore that dimension. But we also have to realize that particularly this idea, when we say global governance for life, captures this idea. And it is very, very important, because in many ways we have crossed the planetary boundaries of sustainability. We are dealing with many emerging challenges of technology. We are dealing with a global, in that sense, a pandemic of mental health issues. We are also dealing with a lot of economic disparity and challenges around that. So when we have a broad challenge like that, how do we realize global governance that is favorable to the global south particularly? So before we get into that, I would want to state India's position on global governance and the global south. And I was looking into what Prime Minister Modi has been saying about this and have broadly listed down some of his thoughts. I think this is very important because we can see how India wants to approach this whole issue of global governance, particularly keeping global south in the focus. So he's recently mentioned that during India's presidency of the G20 this year, India would want to act as the representative of the global south. I think that's a very, very important statement that we have expanded the remit of G20 and India wants to take the representative position of the global south. He says that the global south has the largest stakes in the future as it accounts for 3/4 of the humanity. But the challenge is, though it accounts for 3/4 of the humanity, it doesn't have an equivalent voice. So when you look at the global discourse, though the global south accounts for 3/4 of humanity, it doesn't have an equivalent voice in the global discourse. So he says that an 8-decade-old model of global governance is slowly changing. And the global south should play a very key role in the new emerging order. So that gives a very central focus to the global south as not just aid receivers, but in that sense, playing a pivotal role in shaping the new emerging global order. He says that most of the global challenges have not been created by the global south, but they have affected us more. For example, if you look at the COVID pandemic, or if you look at climate change, terrorism, and the most recent Russia-Ukraine conflict, the challenges have not been created by the global south, but the search for the solutions has to come from us because these global challenges impact the global south the most. He goes on to add that the people of the global south should no longer be excluded from the fruits of development. Together, we must attempt to redesign global political and financial governance. This can remove inequalities, enlarge opportunities, support growth, and spread progress and prosperity. Developing countries should join hands to redesign global political and financial governance to ensure that they are not excluded from development and can remove inequalities. So in many ways, he's saying that global south should not just be a passive receiver anymore. It should play a very pivotal role in the new emerging financial and the global governance order that is emerging. He says that, for example, in the last century, the global south, we supported each other in our fight against foreign colonial rule. We can do it again this century to create a new world order that will ensure the welfare of our citizens. As far as India is concerned, the voice of the global south is India's voice. And the priorities of the global south are India's priorities. So very important that global south plays a very important role in shaping the new global order, and India would want to be the representative and be the voice of the global south. He goes on to add that India has, of course, supplied medicines and vaccines to over 100 countries. This has been discussed in this conference as well during the pandemic. And we have always played this role of how do we support the developing countries. So this is, and he closes with a very important line, which I think should be the takeaway of this whole summit. And also, I'll try to bring it in this session, that the need of the hour is to identify simple, scalable, and sustainable solutions that can transform our societies and economies. With such an approach, we shall overcome the difficult challenges, whether it is poverty, universal healthcare, or building human capacities. How do we cooperate among ourselves to develop these solutions? How do we share these best practices with each other? How do we learn from each other? So the session that we have now is on global south and global governance. I hope I have been able to establish the importance of global south, that is 3/4 of humanity is represented there, and why when India is holding the presidency of G20 this year, we would want to play a very central role in being the voice of G20 and how we can play the global south and how we can play a role in shaping the emerging global order. I would move on to discussing with my panelists from their respective areas of interest, what they perceive of global governance and how Global South can play a role. And then eventually I would summarize. I'll try to keep it within the time limit that we have because I know that we have a session immediately after this. Thank you. Okay, so we have a very esteemed panel, as I said. We'll begin with Dr. Famida Khatoon, who is the Executive Director, Center for Policy Dialogue, Bangladesh. Her areas of interest include macroeconomic policy, aid effectiveness, international trade and WTO issues, digital economy, youth unemployment, health issues. Wide experience, and I would request her to share her comments to begin with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mathur. And good morning to everyone. I would like to thank Dr. Sachin, my good friend, for putting together this great show, which is full of intellectual gratification and also bringing people from all over the world, connecting people. And also, once again, congratulations, Sachin, and of course, my friends from India and all over the places. I'm honored and privileged to be speaking here, and thank you, Chair, Moderator, for giving those kind introduction. So, just taking cue from you, what you have just described, what is meant by life and what does it contain and what are the implications. So the idea of lifestyle for environment, I'm borrowing from you and also from the concept note that it calls for transformation at various levels from individuals to institutions. And it is linked with the values and ethical approaches that should be mainstream for reforming institutions, processes and practices. So that is why in order to deliver on the commitments of life, several institutions will have to be reformed and improved in such a way that it can benefit the people of the Global South, because the existing institutions which are working towards improving the environment and facing and addressing the challenges of climate change are not working. In fact, their governance is fraught with inefficiencies, biases, and weaknesses. One of the reasons for international environmental governance for not delivering is that the aspirations of the world, it is because the institutional framework, it is complex itself. And the governance of environment includes agreements, international organizations, policy instruments, financing mechanisms, rules, procedures, and norms. So it is really a complicated system. And environmental governance also impacts other areas of global governance besides environment, for example, international trade. So I will focus on a few issues which are related to trade also and which have implications for climate change and environment. So outside the treaties, institutions have voluntarily developed various mechanisms, for example, the environmental and quality standards by various organizations, including International Organization for Standardization, and also various codes of conducts. For example, the other areas for issues like corporate social responsibilities for complying to environmental issues by various corporations. So, to say these things is that despite all these initiatives, environmental degradation has not stopped, rather it is increasing. Various international treaties, agreements have been there, but we see that there is biodiversity loss, deforestation, desertification, and various environmental pollution, degradation. The greatest and most dangerous environmental threat is, of course, climate change. And the multidimensional impact of climate change has been recognized by the global community and leaders after repeated scientific revelations and also findings of the International Panel on Climate Change. One of the key global governance mechanisms for addressing climate change is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that is UNFCCC. This treaty that was adopted back in 1992, that is set the framework for international action on climate change. So this UNFCCC has been the foundation for many other agreements later on. For example, the Paris Climate Agreement, which was adopted in 2015, which is very important, and what we are discussing today, yesterday also, a lot of discussion regarding decarbonization, net zero. So Paris Agreement aims to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels, and to ideally to keep it within 1.5 degrees Celsius. So to achieve these targets, countries have taken commitments in COP26 in 2021. All countries, developed, developing, even least developed countries, they have made their commitments through nationally determined commitments, NDCs. And in fact, 151 countries, they have submitted renewed commitments. But even after these commitments, the way we are emitting, this is not enough to keep the temperature below 2 degrees Celsius. In fact, various findings have shown, for example, the UN and also many other United Nations and also the other organizations, they have shown that if this way global emission continues, the countries will have to accelerate their the reduction commitments, in fact. And we have also seen that so this is a huge commitment, and COP26 had really been a breakthrough after the Paris Agreement, and there have been a lot of aspirations and hopes after the COP26. However, it did not take much long. Even within a year, many countries, advanced countries, have changed their strategies, particularly in the wake of the energy crisis which was created because of the Russia-Ukraine war. So developed countries have retracted, they moved back towards their coal, towards coal for energy extraction, so which is a deviation, right away deviation from their commitments, and within a very short span of time. So that's why even if you have a structure, it doesn't really work if it hurts the interest of particular countries. But on the other hand, also we see the contradictions of the commitments. Many of you know that the European Union has proposed to impose that carbon border adjustment, CBAM, in 2023, which is going to hurt the exports of the developing countries and LDCs tremendously, because the whole idea of CBAM is to impose additional tariffs on the carbon embedded in the exports from developing countries and LDCs. In fact, the UNCTAD has conducted a study which shows that it's going to increase the cost of production and decrease the exports from LDCs, and they have developed various scenarios showing that how much exports will be reduced. And UNCTAD study, which was conducted in 2021, it shows that exports by developing countries across the targeted carbon-intensive sectors, which are in fact many sectors, for example, electricity, fertilizer, iron and steel, cement. So if a price of $44 is imposed on 1 ton of embedded carbon emissions, then the export will be reduced by 1.4% because of CBAM.
Dr. Fahimida, you can take some time to summarize.
And if it is increased to $88 $88 per ton, the exports will be decreased by 2.4%. So this is one example, and then I'll come quickly. This is the commitment, but there are other areas that one is finance and the other one is technology. So how the commitments which have been made are not being met. In case of finance, we know that there is huge gap, and at COP15 in 2019, developed countries committed to mobilize $100 billion a year by 2020 and through 2025. But OECD study has shown that so far little above $83 billion has been mobilized. And also there is this difference that 58% of the whole fund is going for mitigation, which is for the developed countries. Poorer countries, developing and least developed countries, their emission is much lower than this. So you can see the discrimination or the divide, the biasness of the fund distribution. And there is also request for fund for loss and damage, which was denied for a long time, but because of the historical scenes by advanced countries, this fund was, there was this urge for this loss and damage fund, and after a long protracted conversation, it has been now recognized. But there is also huge demand. Now, coming to the issue of technology, I will quickly just finish. Technology transfer. This has, as I have mentioned in the beginning, that climate change issues are also cross-cutting issues. Trade has a lot of implications. In fact, trade and climate